Hello, I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm very glad to welcome all of you. As always, I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do at the library possible, particularly now that the library is independent. I hope you will consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. And tonight's program is made possible in part by Richard and Martha Pascan in honor of Martha's brother, Larry Bergheimer, who recently celebrated his 50th anniversary, to Eileen Auerbach. Thank you, Richard and Martha, and mazel tov to Larry and Eileen who are here. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We'll all be muted except our presenter, but people will have the opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. You can communicate your questions in the chat, and I'll then relay them at the end, time permitting. And in order to avoid distraction, I do ask that people use the chat tonight only for asking questions of the presenter. It is great having Rebecca Clarren with us. She has been writing about the American West for more than 20 years. Her journalism, for which she has won the Hillman Prize, an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship, and 10 grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism, has appeared in such publications as Mother Jones, High Country News, The Nation, and Salon. Her debut novel, Kickdown, was shortlisted for the Penn Bellwether Prize, and she'll of course be talking tonight about her recent book, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance, which was selected as a best book of 2023 by both the Forward and Kirkus Reviews, and was recently longlisted for the Reading the West Award. So Rebecca, thank you very much for being with us, and it's now all yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Thank you for joining us. So this book, The Cost of Free Land, it was really prompted by three questions, which are, what are the stories we tell in families, but also in nations? What are the stories we don't tell? And why don't we tell certain stories? I grew up fascinated by the stories that I heard about my Jewish homesteading ancestors who lived in the early 1900s on the South Dakota prairie. There are these stories that I like to think of as like our greatest hits of a family, our family lore. There's the story about my Uncle Louis who could stand on the back of a horse, or there was a story about my cousin who at the age of 5 would clear a path between his house and the outhouse every morning of rattlesnakes. And there's a story that really is the most beloved, particularly by the women in my family, which is a story about how my great-great-grandmother, her name was Fega Etka, she, in the middle of winter in South Dakota, so it's very cold there, she would send her daughters outside armed with an axe or a slab of wood to crack the creek that ran behind their house. And then she would dunk herself in that cold water. That was her mikvah, which, as many of you know, is a Jewish ritual bath to mark the end of your menstrual cycle. And yet, of course, both the stories we tell and the ones we don't create the myth of ourselves that we pass on to future generations. I've been a journalist writing about the American West for 23 years. And really the through line of all of my work is, how do you take seemingly quite boring public policy, American laws, but show how they make a huge impact in the lives of individual families? And during that time, I had reported quite a lot about Native nations, Native communities. But when it came to my own family story on the South Dakota prairie, I maintained a blind spot because my family's land, a place that to this day locals still call Jew Flats, is only 13 miles from the nearest Lakota reservation. And yet there was no family story about my family and the Lakota. I want to read to you a little bit from the very beginning of the book, because I hope it's instructive to understand how big this blind spot was for me. I am a very curious person, of course, I'm a journalist. And yet I maintain what I think of now is honestly an embarrassingly long time, a real lack of curiosity, a real lack of understanding the white space around the edges of my family's stories. So Thank you so much again for listening. 22 years ago, while on a reporting trip to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, I found myself sitting shotgun in a truck with a man who would later become president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. He was smoking weed. When he offered me some, I declined, hoping to indicate a level of professionalism that, as a reporter visiting an Indigenous community for the first time, I certainly couldn't claim. We had driven off a dirt road and were parked at the top of a rise. Before us were green rolling hills and the flat plains beyond. It was gray outside. A herd of buffalo with their dark brown backs dotted the landscape. It is likely that I was wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Back then, this was more or less my uniform for reporting trips, as I believed that by wearing clothes with limited personality, I could signal to sources that my identity didn't matter. In my bag were a camera, a DAT recorder, and my slim reporter's notebook with the binding at the top. I had one great question prepared, which I had learned from a This American Life comic book about how to be a reporter. My boss had told me to write down everything I saw and heard and smelled, but nonetheless, I failed to record whether the man beside me in the truck smoked a pipe, rolled a joint, or how I felt about any of it. Sitting there in the small cab, I was uncomfortable with the quiet. I had yet to learn how to follow a source's lead. I had yet to learn so many things. I'm so sorry. In my nervousness, I decided to share something about myself. I told him that my family used to own land in South Dakota, that we'd had a ranch somewhere known as Jew Flats. I remember thinking this might make him see we had something in common, that this might endear me to him. He was polite. He nodded. His smile was thin in a way I couldn't read. It would take me years to realize what my words would immediately mean to any Lakota citizen. The 9/11 attacks had taken place the week before I visited Pine Ridge. One evening while I was there, over a paper plate of food that was shared with me at a family gathering, I said something about the horror of the recent events in New York. Sitting beside me, a former American Indian movement activist stared at me, her mouth a flat line. She said, "Now you know what it feels like to be attacked and invaded. It's about time for Americans to understand how that feels." The day before, an Oglala elder had told me, "When I saw those people running through the streets with terror, I was reminded of my ancestors running in fear at Wounded Knee." Even then, I failed to connect certain dots, certain historic realities between her, the Lakota, and myself. All these years later, what stays with me from that reporting trip, what seems now to be the clear central narrative, appeared at the time to be only tangential to the article I was there to write. You know, the way I was taught the history of America is a way I think a lot of us were taught. I think it's instructive to say that I had an excellent education. I grew up in a liberal city on the West Coast in Seattle. And yet I was taught, if I was taught at all, a history of Native America in one silo and a history of immigrants in another. And maybe I was taught about Jewish Americans in another. But I wrote this book, what I like to think of as an entangled history, because only when you tell these histories right next to each other that you see the connective tissue between them. You see the way the United States very clearly picked certain groups to benefit and certain groups to be harmed by certain policies. You really can only, in my opinion, in this way, see the depths of the injustice. The book structure toggles back and forth between the history, but also the legacy of that history. What does it mean today? And I suppose I did that in part because I'm a journalist, I'm not a historian, and I really wanted to show the impact of the past to this moment. But also, I think after spending time learning about traditional Jewish texts and also spending time with Indigenous elders, my idea of time even has changed. And I write in the book, I used to think about time as something we're marching, and history is something we're walking away from. But I think at this point, I consider it more like the past is threaded to this contemporary moment, really like thread through a seam. And so because of that, and because of my interest in showing the ripples, as I described before, of how governments create policies and laws and how they ripple out in families throughout time and throughout place, chapter 1 of this book doesn't start in South Dakota at all. It starts in Russia, where my ancestors are from. And so I'm going to read to you a little bit from that chapter as well. To understand how a Jewish family ended up settling on Lakota land, we must begin in Odessa in the spring of 1881, when my great-great-grandfather, Harry Sinekin, was around 19 years old. It was unseasonably hot. In fields outside the city, crops were wilting. An economic downturn had left thousands of factory workers unemployed. People were hungry. A dry wind blew incessantly, raising dust and dirt that fell from the sky like ash. Months earlier, terrorists had assassinated the Russian Tsar Alexander II. Rumors boiled in the streets and the countryside, blaming Jews. Though unfounded, accusations flourished. Jews had long been reviled as different, as Christ killers. In early May, as out-of-work men spilled from taverns, they formed a mob and stormed the streets looking for Jews. Some later reported hearing chants from blocks away, "The Jews drink our blood." Harry Sinekin, drawing on the survival instincts that would serve him well on the South Dakota prairie 2 decades later, dove under his bed as soon as he heard the angry rioters. If he was armed at all, it was at best with a kitchen knife, as it was illegal for Jews to own guns. Others would later recall having only rocks and slabs of wood with which to defend themselves. Harry heard men yelling. He heard windows shattering. He heard the door crash to the ground. The mob smashed every mirror in the house. They broke all the furniture. And then Harry felt the heavy wooden bed frame crash onto his face. His nose broke. Blood was everywhere. The peasants or the soldiers, whoever they were, they found him. They beat him. They broke every one of his ribs, set fire to the house, and left him for dead. The looting of Jewish shops and homes and the attacks on Jewish people continued in Odessa for 6 days. Such violence towards Jews was so common, so systemic in Eastern Europe, that it had a name, pogrom, which comes from a Russian word that means both to destroy and to conquer. Somehow, Harry survived and escaped the burning house. For the rest of his life, he would suffer from the effects of the beating and smoke inhalation. Even so, he was lucky to be alive. This is an immigrant story. Like all immigrant stories of survival, of leaving the known world to flee to a new place, it begins with fear and relies on luck. My family stories about Harry have always followed a classic script. We highlight his pluck and how he overcame adversity on the road to opportunity. We fail to acknowledge the reverberations of our family's good fortune, or the fact that it came at the expense of others. I wanted to show you some slides that I have. My family doesn't throw anything away. I have tax returns from 1911. I have nightgowns from the 1950s. I had 30 day diaries that belonged to my great-grandmother, and who was a Jew Flats homesteader, grew up on the prairie. And we have thousands of photographs. So Howard's going to help me with the technological part of this, and I'm going to show you some slides to help talk about some of the things that happen and are described in my book. So if everyone can see that slide, this is a photo of Kapulia, which is the shtetl that my family came from in Russia. Harry leaves Odessa after that pogrom, never to return, and he returns to Kapulia, which is a shtetl in what is today Belarus. It's near Minsk. And this photograph is of Harry's 2 oldest children. That's my Aunt Fanny and my Uncle Ted. And that's Yiddish that you can see on the top written on this photograph, and we had it translated. It means the Hinterish house. This is the back house behind where they lived. And life for Jews, as you all probably know, was difficult in the Pale of Settlement. They didn't call it a reservation. They called it the Pale of Settlement. This is the area in Russia where Jews could live. And most of these places were small villages. The shtetl Kapulia, where my family was from, Jews were not allowed to own land. And there was a lot to fear. There was often a fear that soldiers would routinely come through these towns, and they didn't have barracks, and they would just stay as a matter of course with families. And women talked about always being, cousins of mine described to my Aunt Etta, who interviewed them in the 80s, that there was always fear that people would be raped. And there was always fear that your kids, your sons, would be conscripted into the Russian army. And Jews were usually, the story is that Jews were always put in the very front of the Russian army and used as cannon fodder. And so because of this, and as pogroms increased throughout the Pale of Settlement and beyond after 1881, increasingly Jews are coming to America, where at the time, immigration was wide open. The United States welcomed immigrants. They were good for the economy. And Harry follows his younger brother out to the United States. It came in part because they had cousins and people they knew already living in America, and in Sioux City, Iowa, which was at the time at the very end of the rail line out of New York City. And at some point, as you'll see from this next slide, Harry learns that there is free land for the taking on the South Dakota prairie. So this is a broadside. This wasn't exactly the sign that Harry would have seen in a train station or in the newspaper. But in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the United States becomes very interested in opening up free land on the South Dakota prairie, these 160-acre homesteads that were yours to keep if you could do what was called proving up, which meant that you had either 3 or 5 years, depending on the year you're homesteading, to tame the wild prairie, which meant you had to put a piece of property, like build something on the land and be a farmer. And this place, so in about 1905-ish, 1906, about 30 Jewish families, 25 families, a number of individual men, Jewish men, they all live Sioux City, and they go up to South Dakota. And to this day, as I mentioned, this area is still called Jew Flats. For those of you who know anything about South Dakota, if you've ever been to Wall Drug, this area was about 25 miles north. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Howard. For my family, this is a picture, the man with the amazing boots, who's the second in from the right side. That's my great-grandfather, Jake Cosberg. And my Uncle Ted is 2 men, who was also his cousin, it was like that, was 2 men over to the left. That was his claim shack. These were the kinds of things people were living in at the time. All of these men were Jewish. Some of them were related through marriage or distant cousins. They all spoke Yiddish. For my family, they told their children this was the good earth. Owning land made them feel more American. It allowed them to shake off their suspect immigrant status. And as my great-grandmother told her daughter, my great-great-aunt Etta Fay, who is still alive, they felt more free because they owned land. You can go to the next slide, please, Howard. So the woman to the far right is my great-great-grandmother, Fega Etka. That's my Aunt Fanny. I have no idea how they kept their clothes so white. There's an assortment of children and grandchildren in this photo. They quickly realized what the Lakota had known for centuries, which was farming without any irrigation, without any dams on the rivers. It was very dry. It's cold, but dry in South Dakota. And they had two crop failures in a row of 2 years in a row, which is a complete crop failure. And so they quickly go in for cows and they become ranchers. These were probably dairy cows, and you can see that shape in the back. That's a sod house. When my family first comes to the South Dakota prairie, they're living in a house made of dirt from the cut bank of the hill. And at this point, I think that was now their barn. So this was a hard life. They worked very, very hard. And yet it was a very good life in their telling. You can please go to the next slide. They had so many more freedoms. You can see Ruth S. That says that above. That's my great grandmother, who I'm named after. Her sister is to her right. My uncle Louis is over there. The guy who could stand on the top of a horse. That's Louis over there on the far right. Here they are. These are Jews and non-Jews. They're all going to school together. This is a school photo, and they're all boys and girls are all together. This was something they would have never experienced in Russia. But more than just freedom and psychological benefit for them, this land, it had real economic impact. I'm an investigative journalist, and I wanted to take these family stories that I had and do something like hang them on something with edges and sides, which is data, which is the scaffolding really of any good journalism. And so I went to the deeds office in the counties where my family owned land, and I pulled every mortgage. Well, first I pulled every deed on the land, and then I pulled every mortgage that they took out. And I did a bunch of math, and I had someone check my math. And when you adjust for inflation, they took out $1.1 million on the value of that quote unquote free land. And when I compared the dates on when they took out these mortgages based on what I'm learning in their letters and their journals, you start to see this pattern that they would take out a mortgage and for a relatively small amount of money, but that would be the seed money for a new business that was not reliant on weather. Or they would take out a mortgage and they would buy more land, or they would take out a mortgage and they would move. They would keep their land on the prairie, but they would move to Salt Lake City or St. Paul, Minnesota, places that were more urban with more opportunity for their children. And yet all of this benefit for my family, it came at great cost. And this book, The Cost of Free Land, it's really about this investigation. What were the myriad costs for the benefit my family received? So if you can go to the next slide, you can see one of these important costs. This is a photo that is a man standing on a mountain of buffalo skulls. Those are buffalo skulls, okay? So in 1851, let's say the middle of the 19th century, the United States, well, first of all, the railroads want to connect a rail line from the new state of California, where you all are, with the East Coast, because of course, California has this raft of natural resources, and they want to, the railroads were the most powerful corporations of their time. And then, like today, corporations had great sway with legislators. And so quickly, Congress is helping the railroads to figure out how to put a railroad line across the United States. Inconveniently for the railroads and for Congress, at that point, the United States had passed treaties, which are legally among the highest laws of the land, with Native nations reserving those lands for those Native nations to have in perpetuity. Also inconveniently were the millions and millions of buffalo that those Native nations relied on and that were living in the midst of the Great Plains. So promises made become promises broken. And by the early 1890s, when this photo is taken, the buffalo the United States had exterminated by incredible intention so many buffalo, millions and millions of buffalo. The population has dwindled to a couple hundred at that point. I mean, it's really, really atrocious. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Howard. You can see this is a map that's at the very front of my book. I know it's a little hard to see probably just on your screen, but What I wanted to show was the dispossession of Lakota land over a really relatively short period of time. So in 1851, the Lakota signed this treaty, this first treaty with the United States, reserving, and the largest line on that map shows the amount of space that they promised would be reserved for Lakota use for eternity. And by the time my family, there's a number of new treaties, new revisions. There's just a blatant theft of land that even in the 1980s, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled was the thievery and theft, that the United States had stolen, unabashedly stolen the Lakota land. By the time my family is planting their first row of crops in 1908 on what had been Lakota land, the Lakota are living now on 2% of what was promised to them and by them in 1851. And they are living on reservations. You can see those are the darkened out areas where they're not allowed to leave. There's always a white guy who's running the reservation, who's been appointed by the Department of Interior. These were called Indian agents or supervisors. And they were kind of like the mayors of these places. And you couldn't, if you were Native, leave. When my family is first on the South Dakota Prairie, they couldn't leave the reservation without permission. They had to have a permit. They weren't allowed to own guns. So they're not allowed to hunt. There are no buffalo left. The buffalo was not just like a very important economic piece for the Lakota. So much Lakota spirituality and legends and lore and history and traditions were entangled with the buffalo. So the killing of the buffalo, I mean, many Lakota consider themselves buffalo people in the way that here in the Pacific Northwest, Native nations describe themselves as we are salmon people. And yet it was more, this effort, this cost was more than just taking of land and the killing of the buffalo, to decrease to attempt to decrease Lakota reliance, caring, interest in the land, to make it then obviously more easy to take more land. The United States makes Lakota religion illegal. It becomes illegal for the Lakota to practice their rituals or to do any of their traditions or speak their language. And as many of you know, their children are taken away from them and sent by coercion or really by force, often with the threat of jail time. Their children are taken away from them and sent to boarding schools, often very far away. The idea was to send them far away where they wouldn't be sort of, spoiled, quote unquote, by the connection with their families. It's very similar to what in Spain was done to Jews during the 16th century, 1600s, when Jewish children were taken away from their families. And I'm sorry, I don't have that exact date, but I think you all know about the time in which I'm talking about. The list goes on and on. There's a line in my book where I say, I know I sound like a broken record, but frankly, the record is broken because it is over and over again, 98% of the Lakota land has been dispossessed by the United States, has dispossessed 98% by 1908. But the efforts to take more land don't stop. There's always a new theory of why the United States decides they're going to take Native land, and it's usually cast as something that's good for the natives. But it's just ongoing over and over again. And there were so many things I learned while working on this book that I didn't know. And I'd be glad if anyone has a follow-up question, I'd be glad to talk about many of them. But one of them, to me, one of the most profound, was something that I didn't know. And it was important to me that it was profound to me that I didn't know, because I was a child who was obsessed with the Holocaust. I really thought as a teenager, I had a tween, I had read every book I could get my hands on about the Holocaust. And yet I never knew until a Lakota elder told me that Adolf Hitler himself was inspired in his treatment of the Jews by how America had treated Native people. He literally, the Nazi lawyers study American law to figure out how to legally diminish the rights of Jewish citizens based on how the United States has figured out how to legally diminish the rights of Native and blacks in America. Eugenics that the Nazis used, that's inspired by what was done to natives in our country. Forcing people onto reservations, which Hitler admired and called cages, and forced starvation, which was a tactic, of course, he employed in concentration camps. Those are all ideas that he took from America. I thought a lot while working on this book about what did my family know? What did they know about what's happening on the nearby reservations to their Lakota neighbors? And I was very fortunate. Before this was even a book project, I had been hired by The Nation and Indian Country Today to write a series of stories about Native America. And while working on one of the stories, I wrote a profile of Judge Abby Abenanti, who lives in Northern California. She's Yurok. She's Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation. And she also was the Superior Court judge for the state of California for most of her career. And she became really, is to me, really a mentor and helped advise me on how to consider these entangled histories. And she said, really, I asked her, what do you think my family knew? And she said, everyone knew what was happening to Indians. And then in the next breath, and this is so her, because she's very compassionate, she said, but when you're running for your life in terror, which is really what your family was doing when they came to America, you're not stopping to have a quick restorative justice conversation along the way. She said, it's gonna take several generations of not living with what we today call trauma. Because of course, when you're an immigrant, it's so traumatic. And if you're a child of immigrants, that's pretty traumatic. And so she said, it's right that it's come to you and to your generation to step towards this, to think about how to heal. And then she told me another thing that sort of changed my life. She said, you need to go to your culture. What does your culture say about how to respond to a harm, even when you didn't directly commit, but one you benefited from? And that led me to spend several years studying ancient Jewish texts, the Talmud and the Torah, with my rabbi, Benjamin Barnett, here in Portland, Oregon. And really threaded through the book is a lot of that Jewish learning that I did, which did help me think about how to respond and how my family could respond to this harm. If you could go to the next slide, please, Howard. So even though there were no stories about my family and the Lakota, there were these mysterious photographs. There's Uncle Louie again in the middle of that photograph. And the men around him, they're wearing traditional Dakota beadwork. And if you could go to the next photographs, that's in Lake Sylvan in the Black Hills. This photograph is my great-great uncle Jack Sinekin. He was my great-grandmother's oldest beloved brother. And the first time I visited a few different reservations and met with tribal historians while working on this book, the tribal historian said, we think this is Joseph Whitebull in this photograph. Again, I had no idea who this was, when this was taken, why this was taken. And I still, very frustratingly, I did so much research and I still haven't really solved the mystery of why they took this photo together. I learned some things, but not a lot. But what it did do with this photograph is being able to identify the man in this photo as Joseph Whitebull, who was a really famous guy. His uncle was Sitting Bull, who was known to be one of America's most beloved and admired chiefs. He was a chief himself of the Minikoju Lakota. And there was a whole book written just about him called Warpath. But knowing him led me to know a man named Doug Whitebull, who the first day I met him, he said, I am the oldest living descendant of the man in that photograph. That was on Standing Rock, which is in South and North Dakota. And the book tells this broad history of Jews and Native people, but it tells it in the specific family stories of my family and the Whitebull family. If you could go to the next slide, please. This is a photograph of Doug and his sister when they were children, and they were living on the banks of the Missouri River in South Dakota. If you could go to the next photograph, this is Doug in a more recent time, also near that same area. The thing about the United States is they didn't stop trying to take more Lakota land. And in Doug's childhood, the United States decides that for flood control, they want to dam the Missouri River. But of course, that is going to end up flooding certain areas. And most areas that were flooded were Native communities. Hundreds of Lakota had to leave their homes and move inland away from the river, which was really the most environmentally profound part of the reservation. It's where the best land was for farming, where there were huge centuries-old cottonwoods, and deer were there. They could hunt for deer, and Doug and his family had to move. I would like to read to you one last section before we go to Q&A tonight, and it's of a moment when Doug and I go back and visit this area, or what is as close as we could get to where he grew up on the banks of the Missouri. Thank you again so much for listening. One day, Doug, myself, and one of Doug's former students, Jeff McLaughlin, drive out to visit what's left of the place where Doug grew up on the edge of the Missouri River. There aren't any roads to get there. Up and down over buttes, we off-road in an old minivan that Jeff calls his VUC. It's a truck and a van, get it? He asks me with a quick, shy smile. Jeff, like many former students, calls Doug Lake She, Lakota for uncle. As we near the cut bank far above the deep blue water, red chokecherries and wild plum cluster in the folds and creases of the land. When we reach the grassy slope where Doug used to run barefoot with his sisters, I ask him how it feels. Feels great. Feels like home, he says, closing his eyes under the bright sun. Swallows swoop through the sky. The air is filled with birdsong and the buzz of insects and the river and the wind. But for the moment, I'm not noticing any of that. I'm distracted by our effort to touch the past. An old cemetery fenced off and thick with chokecherry has survived the flood. While it had been slated for removal, the water never got that high, and the feds, by neglect or delay, left it alone. Deep inside the thicket of wild plants are gravestones of Doug's relatives, and he is determined to visit. Getting there will require this blind old man who relies on his cane as if it were a third limb to do the equivalent of bushwhacking. I explained to Doug where to put his foot and how to hold on to my arm and Jeff's arm. I'm embarrassed to share this part, but it's what happened. On the audio file, you can hear my voice asking if this is a good idea, cautioning Doug to be careful. Jeff quietly helps Doug step over the wire fence, gets a camp chair out of the van, and sets it up in the shade in case Doug needs a break. I should have known better. By this point, I knew a lot of Doug's stories, especially his greatest hits, such as the time he, as a teenager, ran a 50-mile race, finishing with bloody feet. I knew about his time at boarding school, a place that he calls a concentration camp, where he was repeatedly hit and kicked by his teachers, sometimes with a wooden board across his bottom for the crime of speaking Lakota or not making his bed correctly. I knew he'd survived all that and become a straight A student anyway. Not a person given to giving up, Doug slowly but steadily traverses the weedy expanse from the van to the graves deep in the middle of the cemetery. He never slows down, never complains. Standing as close as we can get to the old stones, the words in the marble etched in Lakota, I read the inscription aloud to Doug, and he translates. Here was Mary Whitebull, who died May 18th, 1902, at the age of 4. The shade of the chokecherry makes patches across our faces. As Doug takes a moment to contemplate the graves, I'm struck again by the weight of his loss, of what has been taken from him and his family to ensure a specific brand of American progress. There's a debate described in the Talmud between two rabbis over what should be done if it's discovered that a house or even a palace was built using a stolen beam as part of its foundation. One rabbi says the entire building must be demolished so that the beam can be returned to its original owners. The other rabbi, the far more pragmatic, says the building can remain standing if the full value is repaid. Both rabbis make clear that as soon as it is known that the beam was stolen, those living in the house must do something. They must make amends. Our country was built on a stolen beam. Rabbi Sharon Brous of Los Angeles famously said in a 2017 sermon, "To ignore this history and the legacy of this history diminishes the legitimacy and the power of this house, of this nation." The money that has come to the Lakota was arguably never a fair trade for what was taken, rarely a deal negotiated without some degree of coercion. And the losses compound one another. The flooding of Doug's childhood home, built on the taking of his father's land, and his grandfather's land, and his father's before that. And what of everything else that was stolen? The years Doug spent in fear at boarding school, the state-mandated destruction of Lakota language, religion, and culture. What payment can be made to replace such a loss? Thank you for listening. And I think we now have time for some Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation. So folks are invited to put their questions for Rebecca in the chat, and I will then ask them. And I guess maybe I'll just start with a question that you mentioned towards the end, and the book really deals with how we can respond to this history of America's treatment of Native people. Can you share a little about what you learned about efforts, especially ones that people who at a distance can take part in to repair some of the harms of the past?
Thank you for asking that. I mean, it's a huge question, and I do really try and get at that in this book. I think that there's a couple ways to think about it. The first one is we're really living in a vacuum of federal leadership on this issue, unlike countries like Australia or New Zealand or Canada that have similar histories of colonialism and that have really grappled imperfectly, but they have done some steps towards engaging with these really awful histories of dispossessing Native people, Indigenous people in those countries of their land. We've really not done that at all. There's been one kind of apology that Obama gave that a lot of Native people call a non-apology, because it was done almost somewhat in secret, like it was signed as part of a defense appropriations bill. There was no media present, there was no Native presence present, and it was done on a Sunday anyway. And yet, despite that, there are lots of efforts at the local level. There are land taxes that maybe some of you have heard of, where people can sort of voluntarily make a gift to people living in the communities. And you in San Francisco, if many of you are in San Francisco, may know of the Segurate Land Trust. There's an organization called Jews on Ohlone Land, which if you're interested, they're wonderful people running that, and I'd really recommend you check them out. If you have trouble, you can find my email on my website, and I'm glad to connect you if you can't get to them yourself. I did an event in October at the JCC of San Francisco with Judge Abby. And someone asked this question in the audience, what can I do? How can I do something? And she said, I know it sounds vague, but what's important is like this conversation. And she sort of gestured to me. She said, it's making relationships. It's knowing what people need. She said, I know what she needs and she knows what I need. And I do think that's very important. It's like not being a non-native, is following the lead of Native voices and supporting their efforts and what they want. I did a lot of looking at Maimonides and his steps of repentance and repair. I think it's so incredible to think about how, as you may know, he scripted what are the steps toward repair, and apology comes pretty late in the game. The first step is the first step is to stop doing the harm. But the second step is to say the truth out loud. And that's really what this book is. This is an attempt to tell the truth as well as and complicated and messily as I can. And I also was really inspired by, I don't know, I know you have other questions, so I don't want to go on too long, but there's another portion that comes from the Torah in Deuteronomy that's about measuring your distance. And I think I'll let you read it, and I hope you do, in my book, or you can find it in Deuteronomy. But this idea of how do we all find ourselves in this story, this very American story, because of course, if we're living in America today, we have benefited from the taking of native land. It is the basis of our highway systems. Many of us get energy from the dams that flooded native communities. It's the basis, broken treaties form the basis of most cities in America, especially in the West. So if you lived, if your ancestors came to America on slave ships, or you arrived in America last week, your distance from the harms that were done to Native people is probably a lot different from my distance, which I'm the descendant of homesteaders. But we all, I think one thing that's really important is to sort of start to grapple, as we do so well as Jews, with this history. And I hope it's helpful. In the back of my book, I have a section called Resources for Further Research. It's not meant to be a definitive list, but it is the things that helped me find myself in this story. I also just have it for free on my website. There's a PDF that you can find if you want to look at it there. So thanks for that question. I'm sure I'm not answering that as completely as I could, but I'd love to hear your other questions.
Oh, that's great. And I'll also put a link to your website in the chat. So, so I have a question from Todd Silverstein. This is regarding the Talmudic passage that you mentioned about the stolen beam. He notes that the Supreme Court in 1980 awarded monetary recompense of $100 million, but you describe Native activists who demand instead the return of the land, which he says, i.e. raising the palace to return the beam. What do you think about this?
Well, I think that so the way my rabbi helped me study the Torah and the Talmud is that they are really to inspire us. They're not meant to necessarily tell us exactly how to live our life, because of course there's so many things in the Torah and the Talmud that counteract this idea, these same ideas, or that we would today really not want to follow. So these are opportunities, right? That's the debate in the Talmud. Do you return the land, or do you have to just pay the price? But also Maimonides in the Talmud, in Steps Toward Repentance, makes very clear you want to make an offering that is what the people who have been harmed want. That's very important too. And the Lakota don't want the money, they want the land, because for the Lakota, the Black Hills is as valuable to them, it's as meaningful to them as Israel is to many Jews. It's where they feel like it's the center of the universe. It's where their creation stories come from. It's where they would be and live and do ceremonies for generations upon generations upon generations. And so as one of their leaders famously said, you do not sell your mother. This land is our mother. So for them to sell the land, to take the advice of the stolen beam, would be to be very it would counter their traditions and the way they see their culture. So, I think you have to look at both of them.
Great, thank you. So Shelley notes, I'm quite surprised that the US government advertised the land as Indian land. I would have expected the government to be less obvious about the previous occupants or owners of the land that they were selling off. Do you think your family knew at the time the source of the land? When did your family leave the land? And do you know who holds it now?
I know the answers to all of these questions. I'm so glad. Okay, help me if I miss any of them. So kind of starting at the end and going back. My family, my grandmother and her two sisters sold the last bits of Jew flats in 1970, which was before I was born. They sold it to my Uncle Louis's best friend, who was a homesteader descendant. And that man's grandchildren still ranch Jew flats. They ranch it as a whole piece. And the woman who owns it's very kind. She let me and my cousin Aviva come and visit. We walked around on that land. She let us take home what my husband very astutely described as junk. They were bottles and bits of wood that we found on the land. So that's what happened to Jew Flats. Us selling the land did nothing to, change the balance of power exactly on the prairie. What was it before that? Those two questions. What was it about? What was the first part of that question?
So it was about the government being so obvious.
Oh, so obvious. Oh, yeah. So I know that's a really interesting. So my family, it's important to note that my family actually, that broadside was a little confusing. I like it because it is so blatant. Isn't that so interesting? But in general, people in South Dakota got land in two ways. There was the Homestead Act, which it wasn't obvious that it was Indian land. They just called it free land. And the these articles that I found in the old newspapers from the time, I mean, they ran like ad copy. It was like, come, it was sort of like, you hardly have to do anything and you'll have a perfect like Eden of land. And it's a home for anyone who wants one. And of course, these were like Jews who'd never owned land. They had no idea what they were doing. It was so hard. And I don't know. I don't know what they knew. I don't know if they knew this was Lakota land, but probably they did because the land itself indicated it. Cousins of mine who grew up there in the 50s found arrowheads on the land. To this day, you can see the like impressions in the land of where buffalo, they're called buffalo wallows, where buffalo used to roll around in the dust and in small, shallow leavings of water. And so, and there were even, old teepee rings on the land. The place that my family owned was when the Minikoju Lakota were fleeing the army to go to Pine Ridge and these were the people that ended up being massacred in Wounded Knee. They traveled across what would become my family's land. So I think they knew. I think they did. And there were stories. Once I started asking, there were stories that they were afraid of Indians and that there would be Native people walking by them. That there was this was sort of an old trail that would go through and near my family's land between Standing Rock and Cheyenne River reservations down to Pine Ridge Reservation.
Thank you. So Diana, Scott asks whether how your extended family has reacted to your book and the portrayal of the family in the book. Well,
I love that question. It has not always, it's not been smooth every step of the way. But I have to say, I think my family has been able to hold two things in their heads at once, which is that they're very proud of me and they love me. And many of my cousins, especially people of my generation, I think just proud, which is amazing. I think the people who are the closest to the people I talk about in the book, so my great Aunt Etta, who is 91 years old, Uncle Louie's kids, I think it's been a little harder for them. And we had a lot of conversations and some of those conversations have been really hard. And yet it's been an amazing experience and I don't know if this is my control is of one family, but in my experience, as I just kept showing up for them and engaging and leaning into the relationship and listening to them, here we are. We're still close. And my Aunt Etta was devastated that I included, my family becomes bootleggers, which is this huge shonda in my family. I do write about this in the book. I didn't talk about it tonight, but they're Jewish bootleggers. I have a family member that goes to jail. This was like a huge family secret. I felt like I had to write about it because, I mean, there were so many family secrets I don't tell in the book, but this was one I felt like I had to tell because it has to do with anti-Semitism, that my family still experiences anti-Semitism in this country. And anyway, she wrote, this was painful for her, that secret, that she had felt like she had kept this, she'd been doing her parents a solid, keeping this a secret for so long. And here I am just writing about it and blabbing away. But she wrote an email to me. She had an early copy of the book. This book came out October 3rd. She saw it before that. And she wrote to me right before Yom Kippur. And she said, I'm gonna cry because I still just feel this so much. She said, I'm so proud of you and I love you so much. This was very hard for me to read, but thank you for helping me be more of a realist at the age of 90. So I just feel so inspired by that. Like if she can become flexible in her thinking at that age, like it makes me feel like there's hope for more of us. So thanks for asking.
Thanks. We'll have just a couple more questions. Ruth McGinnis asks whether you had a relationship to the Laura Ingalls Wilder books on white life on the prairie.
Yes, I loved those books as a child, and then I reread them to my children, and I realized how insanely racist they are and how much they perpetuate and really create, I would guess, for so many of us that read those books, a real myth about the prairie and about this being empty land where no one lived, and that these were Native people who weren't making the land productive and who needed to go and were people to be feared, all of that. And in fact, Laura Ingalls Wilder's youngest sister, Carrie, grows up to be a newspaper reporter, and she's an editor of the Pedro News. The Pedro News was like, Pedro was the town where Louis got his mail. Her homestead was not far from my family's homestead. So yes, it's fascinating. I really looked through all the issues of the Pedro News I could find to see if there was any writing about any of that's my family, but I couldn't find anything.
Great. So Judy Cerebrin asks whether your book is available as an audiobook.
It is, and I recorded it. So if you enjoyed listening to me tonight, you can find it. It's on Audible. It's also on Spotify if you have a premium account on Spotify.
Great. And Bob Olesh asks whether your family ended up sponsoring any relatives that came to South Dakota.
Say that, like, what do you mean?
In the way that Jews were often sponsored to come to America, whether they brought other family members to South Dakota.
What I love that you asked this question is it reminds me, so it's chain migration. My great-great-grandfather Harry comes, then the first three oldest kids are here. And in 1905, the Russian Revolution is starting. I mean, it's getting very bad for Jews. And Fega Etka's parents have died, and she says, okay, fine, we'll come. But the money that is used to bring them over, the three youngest children and Fega Etka, I think, based on family letters I found, letters from a bank, the head of a bank, the record makes it seem that Harry gets a mortgage on the value of that land. And it's that $900 that he uses to pay for his family to get passage to America. And so before my great-great-grandmother is even in America, her life and fortune is sort of entangled with the Lakota nation. Yeah, I thought you were meaning, and my great-grandfather, Jake Cosberg, he brought like 14 members of his family over throughout the 30s and 40s and got almost everyone out. But one of his brothers had a son who was already fighting at the front of the Russian army. And so he didn't want to leave to America during World War II. And that entire branch of the family was murdered by the Nazis. So they didn't come.
Okay, well, I'm going to put your website in the chat, and also a link for folks so they know how to. We'll send this also out in an email message, most likely on Sunday, with links to learn more and to purchase the book. Is there anything else, Rebecca, that you want to share with us?
There is so much more that I wish I could have time to tell you, but I think I should let my book speak for itself. And thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you so much.